Hey everyone, welcome to Creating the Comic, episode 3. This week we're talking about editing. So editing is incredibly important at all levels of the process, and almost all creators are going to need some level of it, especially if you're looking for something professional. So unlike the first 2 episodes, which included much more of a how-to element, for better or for worse, we're not going to include that because for the most part, you'll be outsourcing the editing, especially as a beginner. Instead, we will discuss what editing consists of, how it differs from traditional publishing, why it's so important, and strategies on how to find a good editor. So let's get to it. So the first thing to discuss is exactly what editing is. In simple terms, editing is the process of revising and refining in order to improve style, substance, and clarity. As creators, we may have a great idea, but we need editors to help us turn that idea into a fully fleshed out story that's clean and as professional as possible. This is especially important for new comic creators, as we have many blind spots. When it comes to editing, there are several types of editing, each one being as important as the next. Before talking about comics specifically, let's take a look at how editing works in traditional publishing for fiction. The first step in the process is the developmental edit. The developmental edit is the big picture look at the manuscript. It's looking at the overall story, character arcs, pacing, and structure. Here, an editor will work with a writer to ensure that the story is properly structured and has all the essential elements in place to tell a proper narrative. The next step in the process is content editing. Here, an editor is looking for any issues with the logic, continuity, and any inconsistencies. Here, the goal is to make sure that everything is clear, cohesive, and makes sense. The next step is copy editing. At this stage, the editor is looking at spelling, grammar, punctuation, syntax. They're also looking for consistency in tone and style. After this is line editing. For line editing, an editor is working at a paragraph and sentence level with a focus on the prose and finding the author's voice. And finally, there's proofreading. At this stage, the book is finished, formatted, and pretty much ready to publish. A proofreader will go through with a fine-tooth comb to find any spelling, formatting, and punctuation errors. More often than not, this means having a different person for each stage, as there are a few people who can handle all aspects at a high level. So in traditional publishing, this is generally the process, but for comics, it's a bit less structured, and it's quite a bit different altogether due to the nature of the medium. As we've discussed before, comic scripts are more like a conversation between a writer and an artist, so with that in mind, the approach to editing is quite different. An editor is not going to be concerned with grammar, syntax. Now, this is not including dialogue, which is a different thing in and of itself. But they're not as concerned with that as they will be with the clarity and how the pages are structured. Much like traditional publishing, the first step in the process is the developmental edit. At this stage, an editor is reviewing the script for a few things. First, they're looking at the overall content, structure, and pacing of the story, much like in a fiction novel. But they're also looking at how the writer is utilizing their pages. From the number of panels per page to page turns, they're making sure that the script flows properly. Additionally, they're looking at the panel descriptions to ensure that they're clear, concise in their communication. They're also looking at the dialogue to ensure that it's clear, characters have a voice, and that they're not over or under using dialogue. The next step in the process is art direction. At this stage, an editor is working with an artist to ensure that the art aligns with the vision of the story. They'll look at the layout, the panels, the visual storytelling to make sure that the artist is properly conveying the story and whatever emotion is behind it. As we discussed, a comic is a series of static images or moments, and proper panel usage is also an essential element of the editing. So an editor will also work with an artist to make sure that the panel usage is correct. The next step is lettering. So once finished, an editor will look at the lettering to ensure that there's proper grammar, spelling, and punctuation. They're also checking for style and to make sure that it looks good on the page, that the bubbles aren't blocking out art, or that they're not on the margins or the edges of the pages. Much of this will have already been addressed at the script level, but it still needs to be looked over once it's actually on the page. Is the font readable? Are the bubbles properly placed? They're looking at things like that. An optional level is a continuity check. So if the comic is part of an ongoing series, it's important to ensure that nothing in that issue contradicts or conflicts with other stories, and in this case, an editor is going to check for continuity. And finally, the book will go for a final review, where the editor is going to look at the finished pages to make sure they're catching any errors in the lettering or art or layout, and to ensure that the comic is fully ready for printing. So again, there are several levels, and not every creator or publisher will follow the exact same process or the exact same steps. Before we get to how to find an error, I do want to share some important first steps for beginners, by a beginner. So the first thing is something that really helped me with my own script writing. As I mentioned in the first 2 episodes, beginning writers should really focus on writing and just writing scripts and learning the craft of writing comic scripts. So once you have a few scripts under your belt, I highly recommend taking them to an editor for feedback, kind of like a review. This helped me immensely with my writing, as they were able to identify some of my own blind spots and areas that I can improve my writing. They also helped me with areas that my writing was actually strong. So in order to do this, you can either do what I did, which is just hire an editor. But if money is an issue, there are several other ways to do this. You can join a feedback group, find other creators and all, join together to review scripts. You can do this either virtually via Reddit or Discord or Facebook. There are several groups like this. You might find your local comic shop and meet people in person. You can find other creators in any number of ways. So there's several different ways to do this, but finding people to give you feedback on your script helps. Now, the benefit of a feedback group is you'll also be reviewing scripts. And even if you're not an expert, reviewing scripts might help because it may allow you to identify errors in your own writing through other people's writings. It's a situation where if you're looking at your own script, you may not be able to see the forest through the trees, but if you're looking at someone else's, you may be able to identify some things. Another thing that's useful is to find a Facebook or Reddit or Discord group that's dedicated to professional editors and just observe how they work. I'll leave a link to one that I'm a part of. In this situation, it's great because you can almost be like a fly on the wall and watch as professional editors critique work and share their process. It's a great way to gain insight to what editors are looking for. So you're ready to get your book out there, but you need an editor. What kind of editor do you look for, and how do you find them? Well, this can be a little bit tough, but not impossible, and not that hard, really. What kind of editor to look for will depend on a few things, including your budget, the goals for your book, and your own confidence in different aspects of the work. At a minimum, I think you should have somebody look over the script at the early stages and perform a final review. But realistically, if you want something professional, you're going to want to have editors involved in as many levels as possible. When it comes to finding an editor, this can be a challenge, but there are a lot out there. The first thing is where to look. Well, again, there are plenty of groups on Reddit or Facebook where you can find other professionals looking for work. You can also just do a Google search, and you will find countless editors doing that as well. There are also comic-specific websites and portals where you can find forums where you're also able to find editors. I'll leave a couple of links to useful areas that I've used. But even then, if you find several editors, it can be tricky on how to evaluate. Well, the first thing to consider is whether or not the person works in the genre you're writing. If you're writing sci-fi and you find an editor who's only worked on romance work, may or may not be the right fit. If you're writing noir and you have an editor that's done a bunch of westerns, again, it may work, but it also may not. So I think it's important to try to find somebody who has work in the genre you're working in first. And second, you want to sit down and talk to them. Find out how they work. What's their workflow? How do they communicate? You'll be able to gain a lot out of just talking to them. How do you connect with them? Do you feel good about them? Do you not? I think that's really important. Getting references is also helpful. Again, this is a relationship, so you want to be able to know that this person's reliable, that they get your work in on time. And finally, if they have samples, that would be great. It's a little tricky when you're asking for editing samples. It's not like asking an artist for samples of their art, because you're actually going to be looking at things that they've edited, which can be a bit challenging both to gather and to evaluate. So if they have it, great, but it may be a little bit difficult. I'd highly recommend listening to the addendum episodes to this. I have 2 where I have discussions with 2 editors, and they give some great insight into this and into this process as well. So the final thing I'll say about editing is that editing can be both expensive but invaluable. If you're planning a crowdfunding campaign, I highly recommend incorporating the cost of editing into your budget and into your funding goals. Like anything, you get what you pay for, and a good editor can make or break your book. If you're just writing for fun, it may or may not be necessary to have an editor, but if the goal is to put something out there that's polished and professional, you're going to have to spend the money, so really don't cheat yourself. Try to find a way to incorporate an editor. So that's it. Again, I highly recommend checking out the addendum episodes, which will be out a week or two after this episode publishes. In those episodes, I interview a couple of great creators about their process, and it's incredibly insightful. So that's it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, leave a review. We can be found on all social media platforms at portable_whole. We can be found on all podcast platforms at Portable Whole Publishing. We can be found on the web at portablewholepublishing.com, and you can email us at portablewholepub@gmail.com.